Thanks everybody for being here, and I am really looking forward to this. Couple caveats. Tonight I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that once upon a time I sort of kind of believed may trigger post-traumatic stress disorder. If I collapse under stress, administer alcohol. All right. Keep vodka and tonics coming. Okay. If you see the speaker get empty, somebody buy me a drink. Okay. I wasn't joking about that. The other thing is that when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, I once took a semester-long course on the Reformation. We have about an hour and a half. And in a semester-long course, we barely scratch the surface. So you see where I'm going with this. This is going to be, and I've done a little informal polling before tonight's event. And some of you guys know a lot about the Reformation. Some of you are not very familiar with it. So I got to kind of steer a middle ground somehow. I'm going to be using a lot of religious terms tonight that some people may not be familiar with. Because even if you were brought up Christian, if you weren't brought up in liturgical traditions, let's say you're an evangelical or Baptist or Mormon, the jargon might be a little, so if you need clarification on any term whatsoever, please just stop and raise your hand. In fact, I would prefer, most of you have seen me talk before and you know that I could talk forever, but I would prefer not to just kind of drone on and on, but have this as much as possible be a conversation. So I'd like to give you kind of broad outlines of the Reformation, and then let's steer it more towards kind of a Q&A session and an open forum. The interesting thing about the Reformation is still a lot of issues that arose during the Reformation that are still topics today, both in the religious world and in secular life. So I don't care if we chase rabbit trails and digress, because that's sometimes we get our best work done that way. So let's, and then as always, I'll be happy to be available by email if you have follow-up questions. I'll put my email up before we go if things came to you that you'd like more clarification on. So, the other thing is, because I know we have some experts out there, be easy on me, you experts, because I am well aware of a lot of the historical issues behind a lot of the stuff we're talking about tonight, but I'm going to give you the standard version of the Reformation. But there is a whole cottage industry around the Reformation that does not go away. You can find numerous books on the topic anywhere, and so this is, like I said, I'm giving you the conventional story more or less. And the conventional story begins on October 31st, 1517, when a young Augustinian monk, if I use the word Augustinian, do you know what I'm talking about? Sure. No. There are orders within Roman Catholic world, okay, and this time in the mid-1500s, early 1500s, all of Central Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe is Roman Catholic. Parts of Eastern Europe are what? Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox if you're Christian. Southeastern Europe at this time is what? Muslim. And we cannot forget this fact. The people who lived in Central and Western Europe in the 1500s were about 1,000 times more terrified of the Muslim threat than anybody in the United States is today. Okay, we think we're freaked out. If you do any reading in this time, all you're going to read, now they didn't call them Muslims, what did they call them? Muslims. They called them the Turks, because it was the Ottoman Empire. So they rarely used it, but if you go back and read anything from that time period, the 1500s, it's going to be the Turks this, the Turks that. I mean, how close did the Turks come to taking over, how close did the Ottoman Empire come to taking over Europe? Well, in 1529, they besieged Vienna and almost took the city. So this is a huge threat, and this plays a role in the Reformation because you have this threat lingering in the background all the time. So within the Roman Catholic world, you have secular priests who are your kind of run-of-the-mill parish priests assigned to a local parish, but you also have a bazillion religious orders within Roman Catholicism. You have Augustinians, who take their name from St. Augustine. You have Franciscan friars. You have Dominicans. You have orders of monks and nuns and friars living in huge monastic estates all over Europe at this time. The man we're talking about is an Augustinian monk. And the Augustine thing, I don't think I'll dwell on it now. If we have time later, I might be able to explain why that's so significant. And on August 31st, 1517, this Augustinian monk, relatively young, he was also primarily a professor on the faculty of a university in a town called Wittenberg in the eastern part of Germany. The modern state of Saxony, this is, we'll get more into it. Remember, Germany doesn't really exist at this time. Germany, as we know it, as a central unified country, doesn't come about till the 1890s. So, in the time we're talking about, what we think of as Germany is a whole bunch of principalities and dukedoms and kingdoms in that part of the world. So this guy lives in Saxony. This is his picture, his Martin Luther. Yeah, you have to start any discussion of the Reformation with Luther, because he's what triggered it. And so we're going to do October 31st, 1517. And what he does, according to the conventional story, I know some people dispute this, but he took a bunch of items for possible academic debate, and he nailed them. We don't know if he did this or not, but according to legend, he nailed them to the doors of the castle church in Wittenberg. The castle church is still there. The doors burned in like 1760-something. So the doors that are there now, if you go, are not the real doors. Plus they're metal, so how do you nail something to a metal door? I don't know. But anyway, back in the day, you assumed that they were nailable. These, what were these items for discussion called? The 95 Theses. And as you can imagine, 7th and 8th grade Calvinists and Lutherans learning about the Reformation have always had a lot of fun with the 95 Theses. I guess you had to think like a middle school kid. Like with Luther flinging his theses on the door and stuff like that. Okay, so most of the 95 Theses had to do with something called indulgences. By the way, indulgences still exist. They were in the news just the other day when the Vatican said what?
You follow the Pope on Twitter.
You will get indulgences for following Pope Francis on Twitter. Yeah. Yes. No. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So he's getting.
Now, before we talk about indulgences, we have to talk about something else called Purgatory. Purgatory starts to show up in the 11th to 12th century of the Common Era. So you see, Christianity existed for like 1,000 years without much of a need for purgatory. After death, there were only two options, heaven or hell. But then people started to think, well, that doesn't seem exactly fair, because there's a lot of people that probably don't need to go to hell, but aren't quite ready for heaven. So there must be some kind of a halfway house. The whole entire doctrine is loosely based on a verse in 2nd Maccabees, which is a book of the Bible that Protestants wouldn't even recognize. But anyway, the scriptural evidence is flimsy, which I know is the biggest redundancy you could ever have. All scriptural evidence is flimsy. But we're going to have to enter into the willing suspension of disbelief. For about an hour tonight, you have to pretend like you are a good Christian living in the 1500s in Central Europe. Because that's the only way you can get the Reformation. So we're just going to pretend. And so anyway, so they figured out there must be some, logically, there's got to be some kind of halfway house. My Catholic friends still talk about doing burn time, okay? There's a belief that when you die, you're not, most Christians, except for Mother Teresa, who, according to people I know who knew her personally, said she was like a... But anyway, I'm always cognizant this is going out on the internet. One of our things is up to over 5,000 views now. One of our religious seminars is. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. My son told me that. He's tracking it. But anyway, anyway, so this whole concept of an intermediate realm between earth and heaven, purgatory, where you burned off your sins, you became purified, so that you would be pure enough to enter the beatific state of heaven. And then the whole thinking around purgatory grew from there over the centuries into, well, if the church has access to all the merits of all the saints and Jesus and his mother, it would be stingy of the church not to bestow these merits upon people. So what happened was, it is so hard to describe how much of the economy of Europe in the 1400s and 1500s ended up revolving in some way, shape, or form around purgatory. Because if someone in your family died and you wanted them to get to heaven faster, what would you do? You would pay a priest or pay a monastery generally. They had entire monasteries devoted to this task of praying for the dead, to say a memorial mass for your dear departed loved one. And it would knock off X number of years in purgatory. And now we're talking, pardon?
Kind of like the Mormons baptizing after their...
It's not unlike the Mormon concept of baptizing the dead, which is based on a verse in 1 Corinthians, right? Kind of, sort of. But this notion that the church on earth has the ability to impact the fate of people in the life to come was very prevalent. It's based on the words, the alleged words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, when he says to the disciple Peter, I tell you, Peter, you are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Ergo, he becomes the first pope. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Whatever is bound on earth will be bound in heaven. That's why on the papal seal, what is the prominent items you see? Keys. The keys of the kingdom. Given by Jesus to the first pope, Peter. Remember, we're pretending tonight, okay? Don't give me this look of incredulity. It's like, so, what was I talking about, Peter? Oh, the keys of the kingdom. So, the belief was that the church on earth had the ability not only to remit sins on earth, but also to speed up the process in purgatory. Now we're talking thousands of years. I don't know how they figured out how long someone was going to be. Yes, sir.
Perfect lead-in. When venial sins and mortal sins,
yeah,
that would be interesting. And the penalty and the time served in purgatory for a venial sin versus a mortal sin is something that's burned in many young Catholics' minds.
Actually, I would like to come back and revisit that later if we have time. It's a great topic. And actually take notes, Kurt, if things come up that you think would make a great topic for the next religion seminar sometime. I see you're on vacation tonight. Okay. So anyway, I think I almost brought along my Catholic Catechism with me tonight, but I'm pretty sure that mortal sins, you are newt. If you died with an unrepented mortal sin, you ain't even getting to purgatory. I have a... Okay, that's right. Yeah, I think it is. But we can talk about venial mortal sins for sure.
6,000 years.
Is that what it is?
For a venial.
For a venial. Okay.
Her sister Martha Marie.
Okay. 6,000 years. Okay.
Purgatory.
In hell, but it's the same as hell.
Purgatory. Yeah.
Spelled different. Penalty is the same.
But in purgatory, you go in the right direction. Well, anyway. So, what happened was that you could see if you could get people to believe in this, you could get them to cough up money for memorial masses. Now, when we think of a mass, and this is another term we have to talk about a little bit. We think of people gathering in a church and singing hymns and listening to a sermon and like this communal worship experience. And what are some other words for the Mass? This is another word you got to know, unfortunately. Eucharist is another term for Mass. Communion, Lord's Supper, the heart of. Can I move tonight? Is that okay, Vic? Just that when the priest consecrates bread and wine, it becomes for the faithful the body and blood of Jesus Christ, transubstantiated. That is the Mass. But in the Middle Ages, a Mass wasn't always a communal gathering. In fact, most Christians were not receiving communion in the Middle Ages because it was considered so holy, and you didn't want to come to it without having properly confessed your sins, lest you nuke yourself even more in purgatory. And by the time the Middle Ages came around, most Christians were taking communion like once a year on Easter. So when you went to church, you were watching a priest take communion by himself. But a Mass for the dead didn't even have to involve having people like a congregation present. You would have priests who basically non-stop would sit at an altar like this, facing a wall, saying the prayers in Latin, doing communion by themselves, and the belief was that it was reenacting the sacrifice. I mean, it's still to this day. I have a friend of mine. He's a pastor of the largest. Well, if he sees this, I'm screwed, so it's okay. And the largest Catholic parish in another city, and I've stayed with him in the rectory many times, and they live a good life in the rectory. And private parish-trained chef, everything's taken care of for you. And, oh, thank you so much. Wow. Wow.
Oh, you have two.
Oh, nothing wrong with that. Thank you, Doug.
This will be like drunk history.
Yeah. It always is, isn't it? So anyway, we were at breakfast one day at the rectory, and he had an 8 o'clock, you have a daily Mass. This is one of the few things that human beings engage in that is happening every minute of every day somewhere around the world. Mass is happening. I guarantee it. Non-stop, because it is believed this is really it is the reenactment of the sacrifice on Golgotha, efficacious for the redemption of humanity, and this is kind of what makes the world go. And there's still a lot of people, close to 1 billion, in our world that believe this is what makes the world tick today. And my friend knew better, I think, because we were sitting at breakfast, they had an 8 o'clock Mass, and it's like, he just has to throw on his magic robes and get at the altar. But there was a crowd of about 150 people there for an 8 o'clock Mass on a weekday on their way to work. And at 7:55, he looked at me, he looked at his watch, he said, "Oh, time to go kill Jesus." I think he knew. But this belief in doing the Mass, saying the Mass, that if you did one in honor of somebody, like, I mean, this, Doug, that's got to be 100 years off of purgatory right there. Just bringing me a drink, And so you could earn years off of purgatory by getting Masses said, You could earn years off by going on pilgrimages. Indulgences were granted for all kinds of things. Okay? You get, and you can look, if you get honestly, I would encourage you, if you're interested, just that when you next time you go to Half Price, get a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's fascinating reading. It will blow your mind. But, like I said, about 1 billion people believe this. So, the other thing that you could do would be, okay, in 1515, okay, so we're backing up 2 years before that day, Pope Leo X, that's the Pope after Jeremy Irons. If you saw the Borgias, which I think if like we made the whole country watch the Borgias, it would kill religion overnight. It was like the best anti-Christian show I've ever seen. And all it is like real life stories of the papacy. It's amazing. Jeremy Irons plays Clement VII, who's, anyway, you gotta watch it. Because it will help you understand this stuff. Pope Leo X issues a papal bull, which is a word for papal decree, called Sacrosanctus, because he had a big building project he wanted to do. And what was that building project? St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. The building we see on television all the time now, whenever there's news from the Vatican, it is that building. There was a prior basilica there, but it wasn't glorious enough for the needs of the papacy. So they needed a more glorious building, built, according to legend, over the tomb of St. Peter, the first pope, who, according to legend, was murdered in Rome. So anyway, here's the papal bull authorizing the sale of indulgences to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica. The building we still, so that, I mean, that's a modern tie into the Reformation right there. The building that is still there was built off of scaring peasants in Europe about hell enough to cough over money to get years off of purgatory to build this building. And you would get a certificate saying you got the years off. So in order, how do you do that? Well, it's much like today. He particularly leaned on a group called the Dominicans, who are good at this kind of thing, who were like traveling preachers, an order of traveling preachers, were authorized to he had to, now, the thing is, the situation is Europe such that the Pope just can't say, hey, everybody go out and sell indulgences. He has to negotiate with this prince and that prince and this prince to allow the indulgences to be sold within the territory, because there's always a quid pro quo. Because there's political considerations, economic considerations, and this whole endeavor was, it was as complicated as any modern day corporate merger. And it was all negotiated by the famous bankers in Augsburg, the Fuggers. And if you go to Augsburg, you'll see evidence of their vast wealth that they had. So anyway, the long story short, they started selling these indulgences around Europe to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica. So, getting back to October 31st, 1517, and everybody accepted that this was like an okay thing to do. But Martin Luther was interesting. He was not, he's a faithful churchman, devoted to church, devoted to Christianity, but he was something of a thinker. And even now, being an atheist, and even now, completely rejecting the metaphysical, superstitious claims of religion, looking back on it, I still have a bunch of respect for what he did to a certain amount. And the guy who wrote this book, this is the best general introduction to the Reformation you can find. Highly recommend it. Kurt's read it. And the guy who wrote this book is an atheist, and he has the same assessment. And Luther did it. He was someone who asked questions. And when this indulgence thing was going on, he just said, this isn't right. That, like, we're charging people to get their sins forgiven. I mean, it just didn't make sense to him. It didn't square with what he read in the Bible. And so he posted these, what's our race to 95 Theses? The 95 Theses for, and according to some accounts, it wasn't an act of, if you've seen this in the movies, and there's a lot of movies made about Luther and all this, it's always portrayed in the movies like this kind of bold strike for independence, this bold act of defiance as he pounds it into the door of the castle church. And actually, the door of the church was like the bulletin board at Starbucks. You know, like their community bulletin board thing. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to change world history by doing this. It was like, hey guys, you want to talk about this? I mean, that's what it was. And it was written in Latin. Who in the hell can read Latin?
Academics.
Academics is it. So as a and here, and if you read the 95 Theses, they don't sound necessarily that over the top. But when you start thinking about the questions he was raising, you can see how it might get people. Okay, I'm just going to read random theses. Any true Christian, whether living or dead, participates in all the blessings of Christ and the church. And this is granted by God even without indulgence letters. Now, he doesn't question that indulgences can be granted. He doesn't question, in the 95 Theses, he doesn't even question the papacy. All he is doing is saying stuff like, this is kind of crazy because I used a highlighter earlier today. The highlighter doesn't show up in the dark room. Why does not the Pope empty purgatory for the sake of holy love and the dire need of the souls that are there? If he redeems an infinite number of souls for the sake of miserable money with which to build a church? Well, that does sound kind of revolutionary, I guess. Okay. To consider papal indulgences so great that they could absolve a man even if he had done the possible, had violated the Mother of God, is madness. I like that because that's a little taste of Luther. He's very earthy. He has bathroom humor. He has no problem talking about. Pardon? Oh yeah, he's basically I mean, he probably in German it would sound more blunt. But you get the idea that. But even here, he kind of acts like here Christians are to be taught that if the Pope knew the exactions of the indulgence preachers, he would rather that the Basilica of St. Peter were burned to ashes than built up with skin, flesh, and the bones of sheep. What he's saying here is he's being very kind of smart because he's not criticizing the Pope. He's saying the poor Pope doesn't understand what people are doing in his name. And if he only knew, he would stop the sale of indulgences. Okay? Well, unfortunately for Luther, or unfortunately or whatever, okay, you put something up in Latin, but someone who read Latin understood that the kind of the volatile nature of these theses. And so they printed them up in German, and they started to get spread around the Holy Roman Empire like you wouldn't believe. Martin Luther made Wittenberg, ultimately, by the end of his career, a very wealthy city on the basis of the publishing business alone. I read the other day something about the number of millions of copies of books and pamphlets that were printed there, generated just because of the Reformation. Well, but he really didn't intend that. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to spread this all over. And no, he just wanted to talk about it with other academics. Well, that's not what happened. And it got out. And that's the other thing, is that Luther wasn't the first person to raise these questions, but there's a whole series. This is the fascinating thing about history. You know, why does something work at one time that didn't work at another time?
The printing press.
Printing press is huge. Huge, because almost exactly 100 years earlier, there was somebody in Bohemia, a professor of philosophy at Prague University, named Jan Hus, who was asking a lot of the same questions. Now, Luther took it further, because Luther was, Dartmouth McCullough, who wrote this book, says Luther's the kind of guy that would always be fun to spend a night drinking with. But he could go like over the top either direction. He'd either make you laugh like crazy or he'd really piss you off. And he was very impolitic, much like some of my friends in this room, as I look around. And but there's something about that energy and that passion that he personally brought to it. Other people were asking some of these questions earlier, but they were asking it in more polite ways, perhaps. Luther really didn't care about hurting anybody's feelings ever on anything. Jan Hus was a professor of philosophy at Prague University, asking a lot of the same questions. In 1414, he gets called to a council of the church, a council of Constance in what is now Switzerland, under he had a safe travel permit guaranteed by the Holy Roman Emperor, saying, we will let you come to the council and leave the council and nothing bad is going to happen to you. We just want to ask you about your ideas, like questioning priestly celibacy and some other stuff. And he gets to the Council of Constance, and they're kind of like, well, we're going to burn you anyway. And he gets, in 1415, in a kind of a joint decision of the Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy, because this is the dynamic you always have going on. It's not like the Emperor and the Pope and all the kings of Europe were all buddy-buddy all the time. They had vastly competing economic interests, competing military interests. The Pope was at war with France half the time, all part of the same religion. Anyway, they burned Jan Hus at the stake in 1415, but everybody in Europe remembers this. And I got to tell you that story because it comes back later. Well, why didn't Jan Hus get anywhere? Well, because they went back on the safe travel promise, because there was no printing press. So his impact was relatively, Luther's stuff was all over Europe in a heartbeat. So 100 years made all the difference. Printing press, a big part of it. Another part of it was where Luther lived. He lived in a part of Germany called Ducal Saxony. It's actually former East Germany. City of Wittenberg. If you ever get to Germany, I highly recommend to visit Wittenberg. It's a lovely town, and it's kind of now like the German equivalent of colonial Williamsburg, only like in a Reformation way. And it's a lot of fun. Yeah. Can we digress? Germans are such sticklers for everything, you know. And I went to like a Renaissance festival thing in Wittenberg one time. And, you know, I haven't been to Renaissance festivals here, but I've known enough of you guys that have been. And like, there's like people dress in all kinds of crazy costumes and stuff like that, and they apparently have nothing to do with the Renaissance. Like, it's like kind of from a historically accurate perspective bogus. But at the Renaissance Festival in Wittenberg, like they make sure like everything is completely accurate at that time. So you can't have any food, for example, that they didn't eat in Germany at that day. So it's like no German potato salad because potatoes came from the New World. Okay, so it's like sausage and bread is all you get. And so I just want to say they're very kind of anal retentive that way. But it must be this way. We must. But it's a fun city to visit. Great folks in Wittenberg. They drink a lot of good beer. Anyway, the thing about when I say Ducal Saxony, oh, no, I'm sorry. I totally messed up and you didn't catch me. Oh, that was like a fatal error right there. It wasn't Ducal Saxony, that was a different place. It was electoral Saxony. And this makes all the difference. Because the Duke of electoral Saxony was a guy named Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise was an elector. There were 7 electors. What did elector do?
Elected the Holy Roman.
The Holy Roman Emperor. And at the time that Luther was doing his 95 Theses thing, the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Maximilian I, who was old and decrepit and very sick, and they knew that soon they were going to have to elect a new Holy Roman Emperor. And Frederick the Wise was an elector, one of only 7 in all of Europe, allowed to help choose the new. So he held immense power. People did not want to piss him off. So you find printing press. Well, you'll see why this matters in a minute anyway. So, just another little story. Frederick the Wise, the guy who I just erased, he was trying to build Wittenberg. It was a like hellhole, middle of nowhere town. But he was pouring money into building up a new university. He wanted to make it a center of learning in Europe. That's one reason why he nabbed Luther, because he was an up-and-coming professor, and he heard that he was hot, in terms of the teaching circuit. So, bring him in, add a star status to our faculty. Frederick the Wise also did not like this indulgence thing that Pope was doing. He didn't like it so much that he forbade the indulgence salesmen from coming into his territory, because it would infringe on the income that he needed to build up his university and his library and his churches and everything else. Well, there's a Dominican preacher, and I have to mention the Dominican thing, because this Dominican Augustinian thing is part of the equation too. John Tetzel, or Johann Tetzel, was a Dominican indulgence salesman who was like the star indulgent salesman. He was like the Mattress Mac of indulgences. He really was. And he was so good at selling indulgences. And he would come just to the edge of electoral Saxony. And Luther wrote that later on, that he would see parishioners of his drunk off their butts in the mud, cavorting with prostitutes, and he'd be walking down the street of Wittenberg saying, "Hey, well, what's going on, guys?" And they would pull an indulgence out of their pocket saying, "It's okay, Father, I got my indulgence." And they had gone across the river and bought the indulgence from John Tetzel. And that's part of what drove Luther to say, okay, we got to really ask what's going on here with the whole deal. So anyway, because of the printing press, the 95 Theses get spread all over the place. Things get out of hand very, very quickly. Now, actually, at first, Rome wasn't that concerned, because Luther was not a famous guy. He was a young minor monk at a no-name university in the middle of the boondocks in central Germany. And they didn't have time to deal with this. You had the Turks knocking on the door. We're at war with France. We're trying to guard the papal estates, which is a big chunk of Italy. They didn't want to deal with this at all. But John Tetzel was a Dominican, and Martin Luther was a what? Augustinian. And the Dominicans and Augustinians hated each other, and the Dominicans wouldn't let it go. So they challenged Luther, and we'll jump up a little bit. I'm leaving so much out. But anyway, they challenged Luther to come to an academic disputation in the city of Leipzig, also just a beautiful, beautiful city where Bach spent his career. If you get the chance to go to Leipzig, go listen to the Bach music. They still play in the giant cathedral there, and the choir sings Bach stuff. It's amazing. That was much later, of course. But anyway, so at Leipzig, not this Dominican, another Dominican named John Eck, who was a sharp theologian, he was like a sharpshooter, debater guy, debated Luther they wanted to bring him here to debate Luther at Leipzig. And they were big into academic debates back then. I mean, people from the town would actually fill the hall to watch the debates of the great philosophers and great theologians. There wasn't a lot going on. I mean, they didn't have soccer yet or anything, so people took an interest in this. And the Eck-Luther debate at Leipzig, Eck got under Luther's skin, which apparently was very easy to do, And Luther may have been drinking, because he did a lot of that too. And he wasn't careful in what he said. And the thing that really nuked him at Leipzig was, well, you know that guy Jan Hus? He had a lot of good ideas. And when he praised Jan Hus, the heretic who had been burned at the stake, who was like considered, you know, dirtbag and scumbag of all of Europe, big threat to the church, they were like, aha, gotcha. We knew what this was about. You're doing the same stuff Jan Hus did, and you're here to threaten the church. Well, that was kind of another big turning point. So in 1520, Pope Leo X excommunicates Luther, sends him a bull of excommunication. Luther, and the guy had chutzpah. You got to say this. Here again, minor faculty person, tucked away in the middle of nowhere in a know-nothing place in Europe, and he's been excommunicated by the most powerful person in the world. And he took the papal bull, along with a copy of canon law. Anyone know what canon law is? Canon law still exists. It's the kind of the judicial codes of the Roman Catholic Church that dictate every aspect of human existence. And if you're a Roman Catholic today and you want to get your marriage annulled because you had a divorce and you can't get a normal divorce like everybody else, you have to go through a court of canon law. Canon law still exists. Of course, canon law was a way bigger thing back then. It was all the edicts of the church dealing with every aspect of daily life. Luther took a copy of canon law and the papal bull and burned them at the gates of Wittenberg in front of a cheering crowd. So, things didn't get any easier after that. 1521, okay, what? Well, I'll get back to Duke Frederick in a minute. 1521, Luther gets summoned to the Imperial Diet. It's an assembly of the decision makers in the empire. The Diet of Worms, not worms. Worms. Okay? Diet of Worms, I know. And he appears before this imperial, so it's the assembled heads of the monarchies of Europe, plus the Holy Roman Emperor, plus the representatives of the Vatican. The Pope himself was not there, but like all the other cardinals and bigwigs were. He gets summoned to an imperial diet. And he's thinking, what? What happened to Jan Hus? And they gave him safe passage, guaranteed by the emperor. But this time, because of the printing press, and because people were fed up to hear with the oppressive tithes that they had to pay to the monasteries to support the monastic estates and the convents and all the money that was being drained out of Germany by the Vatican, there was a level of popular unrest that was just fermenting. And he was cheered all the way from Wittenberg to Worms. And at Worms, he gets summoned before the Holy Roman Emperor. So yeah, I mean, it's like a professor from Alvin Community College, which I'm sure is a fine institution, but it would be like a professor from Alvin Community College being asked to appear before the president and the Supreme Court and, I don't know, Joint Chiefs of Staff or something like that. And they said, "Are these your writings, Martin Luther?" And he said, "Yeah." "And do you, will you recant them? Will you recant what you said in there?" He said, "Give me a day to think about it." Of course he knew they were going to ask that question, but they give him a day to think about it. He comes back and he says, no. Well, I'll read you what he said, because I think it's still pretty... he said... if then I revoke these books, all I shall achieve is to add strength to tyranny, for a wider and freer range than it has ever dared before. Bear in mind, he said this knowing by saying these words, it probably meant his death. He spelled out to the emperor that without conviction from Scripture or plain reason, for I believe neither in the Pope nor councils alone, I can recant nothing. And if you saw the movie, it says, here I stand, I can, no, he didn't say here I stand, that was added later. So, that takes chutzpah. And in a minute I'll get into some of the other things that he was, in those writings that he would not recant on. And so what happens is, this time the Holy Roman Emperor actually honors the safe passage. And he allows Luther to leave Worms. And the minute he gets back into electoral Saxony, he's kidnapped. Huge horde of knights on horses, actual knights, came thundering down the hillside, dragged him out of his whatever buggy thing he was in, and kidnapped him. And that was a friendly kidnapping. It was a kidnapping arranged by old Frederick the Wise. And they whisked him away into a castle called the Wartburg Castle, overlooking the town of Eisenach. And here again, out in the middle of nowhere. I've been to the Wartburg, and you can see how someone who had to spend any amount of time there would just go absolutely stir crazy. Because it's just, I mean, it's kind of a spooky place to begin with. And they hid him away in this castle up in the mountains for 10 months, basically to save his life. And actually, for the rest of his life, he was at it's the Wartburg, if you want to look it up. Great pictures of the Wartburg. He never left Saxony again the rest of his life, because the rest of his life he's under the ban of the empire. If he had stepped foot outside of Saxony at any other point, anybody could have killed him on the spot, and they would have been rewarded for it. So, he spends 10 months in the Wartburg. So he's out of commission. He's out of commission. We'll go back and talk a little bit about what happened to the Wartburg when he was there. He grew a beard. He took on an alias. It was like a kind of a total witness protection program thing going on up there at the Wartburg Castle. Oh, by the way, the Wartburg Castle is the second most visited castle in Germany. I mean, not in Germany, in Europe. The first most visited castle is, Mad King Ludwig's castle in Bavaria, which is kind of a fake castle built by some guy in the 1800s who wanted to build his ideal medieval castle. So can you see that picture of the castles, the big Neuschwanstein, right? When you see the picture of Neuschwanstein, which the Disney castle was modeled off of, okay, it had no strategic value, no political value. It would never serve as a castle of thought. He wanted a fairy tale castle. And if you go there, you'll find out that he built it to be his kind of secret gay love nest. So that's what it was about. Yeah. So that's the story of that castle. But we digress. Anyway, so when Luther is tucked away in the Wartburg in 1521 for 10 months, basically all hell breaks loose. All throughout. He's let the genie out of the bottle. Oh, I have to back up a minute, because it wasn't just the indulgences thing. Because what happens is when you piss Luther off, he gets more pissed off. He's not inclined to become more diplomatic. And so when they didn't like what he said about indulgences, he was like, well, if you didn't like that, try this. And he started challenging priestly celibacy. And he said, come on, gang, all the priests are living with women anyway, most of them. And we all know what's happening. They're all living with their housekeepers. The celibacy thing isn't working. So he challenged priestly celibacy. He challenged the priesthood itself. He said, I find no evidence, evidence in Scripture, I know, that there is such a thing as a special order of beings called priests. And he said in his letter to the German nobility, it was one of the 3 big treatises he wrote in 1520. This is when he really got into trouble with writing these treatises. He said, the minute a Christian is baptized, any Christian, male or female, that person is ordained a priest just as surely as if he or she had been ordained a priest by the Pope and the cardinals and all the bishops. That didn't go over so well either. So he's challenging indulgences, challenging priestly celibacy. He wants worship to be in the language of the people, the vernacular. What language were they worshiping in? Latin. They worshiped in Latin until the 1960s, until the Second Vatican Council. He wants to introduce congregational singing. He was a gifted songwriter. And ended up writing a lot of hymns. In fact, so later on, and during the Counter-Reformation, one Jesuit scholar said Luther killed more souls with writing than he did with all the books that he wrote. Because people liked his hymns. They were fun to sing. And so, oh yeah, sacraments is the other thing. Because everyone know what a sacrament is? Okay, a sacrament is a religious ritual that is, for just to oversimplify, is a channel of grace. It is a religious ritual through which the church dispenses God's grace to the faithful. In the Roman Catholic tradition, there have been 7. Baptism, communion, which is the Mass, the bread and the wine, penance, confession, marriage, confirmation, holy orders, which is becoming a priest,
Holy extreme unction,
and extreme unction, which used to be called last rites. Those are your 7 sacraments. And part of what Luther was, and Luther was part of this movement.
It's been a long time.
I don't blame anybody for not remembering those. I really don't. And he said, Luther said, where do we get these from? These are just mechanisms by which the church is trying to control the faithful. We don't need, none of these things are like, it's like, why is marriage a sacrament? Because everybody in the world gets married. Why is this like some kind of sacrament? So Luther narrowed it down from 7 to 2. Well, kind of 2.5. He wasn't sure about penance. But he narrowed it down to what? Baptism,
the Eucharist.
And yeah, the Eucharist or communion or the Mass.
And what do the sacraments actually do for you exactly? What do they give you? Or,
What is grace?
I mean, what do they? I mean, what
Yeah,
are they?
the answer to what is grace depends upon which denomination you're talking to. But in the Roman Catholic tradition, grace, I get the idea that it's like this, like, kind of powder, you know, that gets channeled through the, it's like you get, they talk about being infused with grace. Luther redefined grace. Luther said grace was God's kind of charitable attitude and love for humanity. That's all he saw in it. And that was the other thing. Luther really, the big one, I don't have to have the big one. Because this is where all the Protestants took off from here. All Protestants agreed with Luther on this. Luther really detested the fact that no matter how hard he prayed or he was a monk and everything else that he did, he never could feel like he was pleasing God enough because there was always a threat of judgment hanging over him. And it really bugged him that the church commanded him to love God, but everything he saw in the church caused him to actually hate God. And it really bugged him. He says, like, okay, so how am I going to get to heaven if I hate God? Right? So for Luther, the answer came from reading Romans chapter 3, where Paul says, for we hold that a person is made righteous by faith alone apart from works in the law. It's Romans 3:27 or so. So anyway, this doctrine, now this is, I didn't want to get too much into doctrine, but you have to, this is what drives all Protestants today. Joel Osteen believes this, Ed What's-His-Face believes it, Rick Warren believes this. This is the cornerstone of all non-Catholic Protestant Christians today. Justification by faith alone. The idea being that you cannot do anything to earn your way into heaven. All you have to do is repent of your sins, turn your life over to Jesus, and you'll be there. Because he did everything for you. On the cross, he paid the sin debt that all of us have incurred, and although we deserve judgment, he gives us, if you accept Jesus, you get to go to heaven and experience his blessings on earth. I'm not defending this, I'm just explaining it. Yeah.
I was
But you do need to know know this because this is what all your neighbors believe. There's a hymn, and some of you guys who grew up in the evangelical tradition would know this hymn. Everybody, this is Luther's idea that everybody picks up on. Not everybody picked up on the other stuff, but everybody picked up on justification by faith alone. Charles Wesley, who started what? The Methodist movement. The Methodist Church, started by, John Wesley. His brother Charles wrote the songs. There's a hymn, To God Be the Glory, which is sung in all the Baptist churches, every evangelical church, and it has a verse that goes like this. The vilest offender who truly believes that moment from Jesus a pardon receives. Does anybody remember that song?
Sing it for us.
After my next drink, I'll sing it. Yeah. So, anyway, I will say this, though, I do not defend Luther's, his theology, because it's all crap. I understand that now. But Dartmouth McCullough, who wrote this book, an atheist, says at the end, I love this, he says, and in a minute we're going to get into the implications of this and what happened, how it affects us today, but this is just one line. The answers of the past to human agonies may not seem like sensible answers now, but they deserve our respect and our attempt at comprehension. We have witnessed across continents and oceans a flux of angers, joys, destructive violence, search for silence, and search for the infinite. It is worth remembering that the people of the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, were as capable of ruefulness and humility as, at best, we can be. And I really like that a lot. He says we have to look at them in the context of their times. And one thing I still do admire about Luther was he had this hunch that life was supposed to be joyful. He had enough of a religion that hung the threat of purgatory and hell over people their entire lives. And he did, I got to tell you, so anyway, so he comes back from, so all hell breaks loose. Because it became, all of Europe became, for the rest of the 1520s, or at least up until the mid-1520s, like China during the Cultural Revolution. People went crazy. They started smashing the statues in the Roman Catholic churches, because now they saw those graven images. The monks and nuns started fleeing the monasteries and the convents. It was like, we don't have to do this crap anymore. We're going to go out and, live a normal life. In fact, for a while, Luther ran a kind of, among everything else that he was doing, the guy, he never held an office either in the church or in the political world, and yet for that period of time, his household was the center of Europe. He ran a kind of a halfway house type thing for runaway nuns who were fleeing the convents. Because a lot of people went to monasteries and convents that didn't really want to go. And life sucked there, and Luther knew it because he had been in the monastery. And so he started like this matchmaking business where he would connect the runaway nuns to priests in the area he knew that wanted to get married. And it was very successful. And they, it wasn't a business. He wasn't making money off this. It was just, and there was Christian label. Yeah. It was their early version of Christian mingle. Exactly. And there was one nun that he couldn't marry off. He couldn't find anybody for her. Or she refused everybody that he offered. And finally said, what's the matter? You're turning everybody down. She goes, that's because I'm going to marry you, Dr. Luther. And he's like, okay. And so he got married to her.
I love that. Well, she was married to Christ. Don't you beat that?
Well, no, people did not see him as Christ. No, people did see him as kind of a prophet.
She was married to Christ.
When she was a nun, she was married to Christ, yeah. No, she said, I'm going to marry you, Dr. Luther. And she said, okay. So they got married. Not the most romantic way to begin a marriage, but fortunately, And this is one book. I'm not going to recommend that you read anything else that this guy wrote, but there is a book called Table Talk that is just a collection over the course of some 25 years of people who came and ate at the Luther's table night after night, people from all over Europe. Some of them are famous people you would recognize. And some were just students at the university. And they would sit around and they would drink beer. And here's the deal. Luther was a theologian and he was a monk. He had no business sense whatsoever. He had been taken care of his entire life. Katharina von Bora, his wife, ended up running the finances of the house. When they got married, Duke Frederick the Wise, I was trying to think if he was still alive. He was. He died shortly after they got married. He gave them the Augustinian cloister where Luther used to live as a monk. If you go to Wittenberg, it's like this enormous cloister, but it had been empty because everybody left the monastery. And so the Duke gave it to Martin and Catherine, Katie, for a wedding present. So, but you got to think, it's kind of like, gee, thanks kind of thing, because it's like he's still living on a college professor's salary. She's making no income, and they have this ginormous house to take care of. It would be the same thing today. It's like, yeah, it's kind of a mixed blessing. But she was a sharp, sharp woman. She brewed beer in the basement of the monastery, alleged to have been some of the best beer in Germany. And she carried on all these other little side businesses, and she made Luther a very rich man by the time he died. Not on the basis of anything he did, solely on her business sense. Taking in boarders, cooking, and the beer, and it was really what did it. And they think beer is what kind of kept him alive as long as it did, because he dealt with like kidney stones much of his adulthood, and they think that Katie's beer kind of flushed a lot of it out, is what they're saying. Anyway, she's an amazing woman. Oh, so here's the thing. When he died, he left everything to her in his will. And apparently in those days in Germany, you couldn't do that. You had to leave it to like a male heir of some sort. And he left everything to Katie. And so what the city council of Wittenberg did is said, well, this is clearly illegal. You have to we have to name kind of a caretaker for you who's going to administer the estate. And so they named Martin Luther's best friend, who became kind of caretaker in name only, just let her handle everything. So fascinating life. Fascinating life. Now, but like I said, the dark side is all hell's breaking loose all over Europe. Mobs are vandalizing churches, and so there's this like, what do we do now? Dark side, there's many, many dark sides to the Reformation. We do have to talk, what time are we getting to now?
Yeah, it's about 10 after 8.
Oh, crap. Oh, well. I got nearly as far as I wanted to. Let me talk a little bit. Okay, dark sides. Reformation plunges Europe into decades and decades of war, culminating with the 30 Years' War, which really was 30 years long, during which anywhere from estimates are from 25 to 40% of the population of Germany perished during the 30 Years' War. Primarily battles over the nature of religion and what happens in communion. What happens when the bread, does it become the body or not really the body or whatever? This is what people were killing each other about. And so the religious wars continued. They were let loose because of this. What happened, I have to talk, actually we should do a whole, Luther left, the Lutheran Reformation left more of an impact in Germany and Germany's political development that, if we have time, I might touch on briefly. The more important wing of the Reformation in terms of our purposes and what affects our life today was called the Reformed wing. Because at the time that Luther started writing his pamphlets and stuff, like I said, Europe was ripe for this kind of thing. Meanwhile, what's happening down in Switzerland? Well, down in Switzerland, you have a guy, the first guy to come along is Zwingli, and you're going to have Luther's first generation reformer. In Switzerland, you're going to have the second generation reformers. Ulrich Zwingli is a very gifted parish priest, preacher in Zurich. And he's very sympathetic to what Luther's saying, and he starts taking the Reformation down there. But Zwingli wants to go even further than Luther. Luther's Reformation was ultimately a very conservative Reformation. He didn't want to do away with the Mass, he wanted to reinterpret it. He wanted to keep the vestments and the candles and the pipe organs and even the statues. He had no problem with statues. But down in Switzerland, people started taking the Reform a different direction. And so you had the southern branch of the Reformation forming down in Switzerland. And then who comes after Zwingli, the big guy? John Calvin.
John Calvin, father of American Christianity.
But John Calvin is, I don't know who said, did you say that, Jim? Yeah, he is essentially the father of American Christianity, really. Because through just the way the world develops, it's the Calvinist side of the Reformation. Calvin goes further than Luther. Calvin was like a really grim, depressed Luther. He was not... and he had a different take on things. Calvin was active in what city? Geneva. And essentially, Calvin's vision was, let's make holy community on earth. He built, this is a gross oversimplification, but he built a theocracy in Geneva. He built the Reformed Christian version of Tehran in Geneva. And he was the Ayatollah. Absolutely. The Southern Europe, or that's not Southern, but the Swiss, Zwingli Calvinist side of the Reformation believed in that the Bible was a blueprint for the perfect human society, and they're big on resurrecting Old Testament laws and using Old Testament standards to govern human life. They reenacted the death penalty for just about everything you could think of. Calvin totally gets dancing or any form of like enjoyment of life whatsoever. It was a very different side to the Reformation. Now, why is it? How does it impact us? Well, because as the Reformation is spreading across Europe, and Calvin's everybody starts with justification by faith alone, including Zwingli, including Calvin. Everybody jumped off of that key insight from Luther, but they went different directions. So, so we sometimes call them Calvinists. They're also called the Reformed Church. Reformed through various historical accidents. The Reformed ended up becoming where do they end up becoming kind of their primary territories?
Germany and Holland.
Parts of Germany, but definitely the Netherlands. Yes. So the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Switzerland.
They were the Huguenots in France.
Huguenots in France, and where in the British Isles? Scotland.
Yeah.
Because of the work of John Knox, who went to Geneva and met Calvin and came under his influence. Scotland goes Reformed. Scotland is where they become Presbyterian, which simply comes from the Greek word for presbyter, which means elder, and it was based on the kind of church government that Calvin saw as the biblically mandated form of church government. And so this is how it gets to the United States. So in the United States, the Lutheran side of the Reformation had very little impact. Lutheran side of the Reformation went north. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, that whole section of Europe goes entirely Lutheran. But these are the folks that came to the New World. And so Christianity in America, heavily influenced by Calvin. So I think today, the impulse of Christians to want to impose so-called Christian values in the political sphere comes directly from Calvin. There's a direct line of descent. Now, I went through a lot of people, like John Knox and the Pilgrim Fathers and everybody else, but it still goes right back to him. Now, you contrast that with Luther. Now, Luther said something that would be incomprehensible to evangelical Christians in America today. And I don't want to get into his theory of state and church relationships right now, because although it's interesting, because it has an impact on the development of Nazism. If we have time to talk about that, we can. Because there's a whole different story in Germany, which is fascinating in its own right. But since we're here today, we should talk about this. Luther once said, I would rather be ruled by a smart Turk than a stupid Christian. Can you imagine an American evangelical preacher today saying, I'd rather be ruled by a smart Muslim than a stupid Christian? No. Luther saw church and state as entirely different realms. He had this theory of what he called the two kingdoms. And it may be kind of the first hint of a notion of separation of church and state. It was problematic. It didn't work perfectly. He depended on the state way too much. But he had this theory that what we're doing here in church, you know, he really believed that if you were a non-believing ruler, but you were ruling justly, that the matter of your faith didn't bother him. That was between you and God. Which, you got to think, for the 1500s, that's pretty revolutionary, I think. But anyway, we in the United States got stuck with the Reformed people. And the desire to build a theocracy, which is still there. And the history of blue laws. The idea that the government should be enforcing when people can have fun. Calvinist idea. Okay?
Where did the Anglicans and the Episcopals?
I was afraid you were going to ask about that.
Henry VIII.
Interestingly, in 1521, when Luther is condemned at the Diet of Worms, massive burnings of his books across Europe. And King Henry VIII got on the bandwagon because he was a fierce, supporter of the church. And King Henry VIII published a book attacking Luther. And for publishing this book attacking Luther, King Henry VIII was awarded by the Pope a new title, Defender of the Faith, which, interestingly, is a title still, one of the many titles still borne by the Crown of the United Kingdom today. The Defender of the Faith title, if you look at Queen Elizabeth's long title, Defender of the Faith is in there. That title was bestowed on Henry VIII by Pope Leo X. But shortly after that, not too long after he got this, like a cardinal visited London, gave him this big medal, and shortly after that,
He fell in love.
he fell in love with Anne Boleyn, and Catherine of Aragon was not producing any male heirs, and he wanted that marriage annulled. And that's when, so it's by 1537 that Henry VIII has completely broken from Rome, and he's made himself the head of the Church of England. He used the same theologians who ghost wrote the tract against Luther to write another book supporting his decision, and they found justification for him becoming head of the church partly in the stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Oh, I got another good one to tell you. This is the Anglican. So that's the
So are
beginning
they
of the church.
conservative or are they the Reformed?
They tried to find what was called the Via Media, the middle way. And they wrestled back and forth on this actually over centuries.
So they can maintain their own power base.
Yes. But you had separatists within the church. The Pilgrim Fathers who came to the United States were Calvinist separatists at work within the Church of England who abhorred the liturgy, who abhorred the vestments, and anything that smacked of Roman Catholicism. Now, the Episcopal Church of England tradition retains a lot of, it looks very, very Catholic in its worship, but if you look at the founding kind of theological documents, like something called the 39 Articles, heavily influenced by Calvin. Luther retained a very Catholic understanding of what happens in communion, which is why Philip of Hesse, a German prince who was on Luther's side, tried to get Zwingli and Luther to kiss and make up. And because it would be really handy to have a united Reformation. I mean, we had this massive Roman Catholic Church, and now we're starting to splinter all these. Why don't we just have one Reformed tradition? So Philip of Hesse brings Luther and Zwingli together in 1529 at his private castle in Marburg, Germany, for what became known as the Marburg Colloquy. And it's a negotiation. Really, this was a huge, huge deal, because you had Luther and Zwingli for the first time meeting face-to-face forever, and they agreed on everything else, except communion. And Martin Luther famously took a piece of chalk, and this is not legend, because enough people like him who said it really happened, took a piece of chalk, and there were enough eyewitnesses to see it happen, and he wrote on the table in front of Zwingli, Hoc est corpus meum. What does it say? This is my body in Latin. And he wrote it, and he circled the S, and he goes, from this is I will not move. Because those are literally the words in Scripture. Now, I can, at another religion seminar, I once explained to you guys why that's all crap anyway, but because Jesus didn't even say that. But, you know, in Luther's mind, of course, this is what his Lord and Savior really said. And so because Luther essentially retained a Roman Catholic understanding of what he didn't like the term transubstantiation, because he didn't like Aristotle, which is where the term came. Anyway, so anyway, but the thing, the one I forgot, this is a new one for me. I learned this. Everything else I told you, I actually knew already, so I feel okay. But the one of the tidbits I learned was when Zwingli kicked off, or when he joined with the emerging Reformation in Zurich, it started in, I think it was, hang on, let me get my notes. This was too good to pass up. It was, so bear in mind, this is 1521, so I don't need it in the month. It's the first Sunday of Lent in 1521. Luther is hiding in the Wartburg Castle. He's out of, all of Europe has, literally no one in Europe knew where he was, except for Frederick the Wise. So Zwingli is, but, you know, the ideas are spreading, the Cultural Revolution is taking off. And so the first little sign of rebellion in Roman Catholic Zurich, the first little kind of sprout of the Reformation there was on the evening of the first Sunday of Lent, the penitential season before Easter, which, what are you not supposed to do during Lent? Eat meat. On the first Sunday of Lent, a printer named Forschauer invited 12 friends, you get the symbolism, to a dinner at his place, and he carved up 2 sausages and distributed the pieces of sausages to the 12 guys around the table. Zwingli was present, but he did not participate. And in the history books, kid you not, this became known as Forschauer's sausage eating party. I did not make that up. They came out of
The first sausage.
the first sausage fest.
First fest.
I've left so much out, we're running out of time. Any questions?
It was the best of times, it's the worst.
Best of times, the worst of times. Yeah, worst of times. Yeah, Jim.
How does Michael Cervantes and the other
Savonarola?
Jacob Arminius, how do they fit in?
Oh, those guys. Arminius. Arminianism comes in later. That's more of a second or third generation Reformation. Oh gosh. That topic gets so... I went back and did a little... I never really understood the thing on Arminians. The Arminians rejected... One of the big things for Calvin was... Luther kind of sort of admitted that if you're saved by God's grace alone and you play no role in it, there is an element of predestination there. Calvin was like predestination on steroids. And for some reason, in the United States today, this is why you need to know this stuff, there is a resurgence of neo-Calvinism among certain crowds of hipsters in some American cities. This is the most bizarre thing. I mean, of all the people in history to resurrect, Calvin is not one of them. And check out a church in Seattle called Mars Hill. You have to make sure it's Mars Hill, Seattle, because there's Mars Hills in other cities that are different. And you will see a very in-your-face, brutally masculine, macho pastor who's tattooed and pierced and everything, espousing a neo-Calvinism as hard as anything as Calvin espoused in Geneva in the 1540s. And now, Mark Driscoll is his name, and you just look up, just Google Mark Driscoll. If you want some entertainment before you go to bed, you'll find every outlandish thing. Like, and he's big on this thing about men playing the man's role and being the head of the family and all this. And he said stuff like, if you drive a minivan, you are a mini man. And he's proud that he drives a big gas-guzzling SUV because I know the world is getting hot and it's going to get a whole lot hotter when Jesus comes again and stuff like that. It's a megachurch. A megachurch in Seattle, drawing people largely in their 20s and 30s. Big gay bashers. Big gay bashers. Mark Driscoll. Seattle.
Perfect city for gay bashing.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, sir.
Can you give us a quick summary, 2 minutes or less, of the Council of Trent and the Catholic Counter?
The Counter-Reformation. Yeah, this is huge. The Counter-Reformation, was it like 1547-ish? Or a couple of years, because the councils back then took years because you had to draw people from all over Europe. It's like you just couldn't get on a plane and get there. So like it took a while to assemble a critical mass to start your council. So the Roman Catholic Church, in response to the success of the Reformation, was hugely successful. They mounted, they called a council, which is a gathering of the bishops and of the cardinals and the theologians, along with the Pope, at the city of Trent. And the Council of Trent kind of kicked off the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation, the official Catholic response to saying, we have to get our stuff, we got to do stuff. One of the things they did at Trent was for the first time define the 7 sacraments had not actually been formally defined. Remember I told you Luther had a problem with 7, took it down to 2. At the Council of Trent, they said, yeah, it's 7. Okay? And so all you guys who were raised Catholic, that 7 sacrament thing was not formally decreed by the church until 1547. Another thing they did is they started to push that, buttress the power of the papacy. And so, but they didn't have papal infallibility. They took it very, very close at the Council of Trent. They took it very, very close to papal infallibility, but they did not cross that river at that point. That only happened when? 1870.
Was that the First Vatican?
First Vatican Council. So the Pope was not officially, according to church doctrine, ever infallible until 1870.
Then he gained infallibility.
Yeah. Now,
Just like
that, yeah.
Like
but bear in mind, the Pope is only, they're smart about this stuff. They don't think that, when the Pope's telling a joke after dinner, he's infallible. No, they don't believe that. He's only infallible under very specified conditions when he is speaking ex cathedra, from his throne, from his chair. And a Pope has only done that twice. Doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, doctrine of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary into heaven. That is, Mary did not die, but she got magically sucked up into heaven. So, those are the only 2 times the Pope has ever spoken infallibly ex cathedra. So, and then the other stuff, I mean, yeah, you can spend a whole night on the Counter-Reformation. Because the other thing it does is it gives impetus to people like St. Ignatius Loyola, who founds what group?
Jesuits.
The Jesuits, who become like the frontline soldiers for the Pope. And these other very aggressive missionary groups that are going to kind of reclaim the ground that they've lost and take the faith to new places, like the New World. Central America, South America, and everywhere else. Yes?
I'm trying to figure out how the sort of Protestant work ethic comes into this.
Excellent.
When you have predestination already, but then you have this sense that what you do determines where you go.
I almost think I paid you to ask that question. The term Protestant work ethic was coined in the 1890s by the economist Max Weber. And what he referred to, and actually it makes a lot of sense, and this does impact American life, at least in the formation of the United States. Oh, just by the way, another way, I was thinking of other random ways in which the Reformation has shaped our history. I think by the time our founding fathers set about to create a new republic, all that stuff was fresh in their memory. The 30 Years' War, the devastation of Europe. And they did not want to see religious conflict like that come to the United States. So that played a factor. But getting back to your question. Okay, and the technical term for this, a phrase you will never use, prelapsarian double predestination. Prelapsarian means before the fall. Double predestination means before the fall of Adam and Eve into sin, even before the world was created, the Lord had already decided everybody was going to heaven and everybody's going to hell, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it, literally. So,
is that Calvinist?
That is strict Calvinism.
Okay.
Yes.
I want to make sure. Okay.
Calvin believed that. Mark Driscoll in Seattle believes that. His megachurch of hipsters believe that. So the problem is, how do you know? Because that's a very different twist from
You're saved by grace.
You're saved by grace, or like Luther was all about the assurance of salvation. Baptists picked up that theme. In the Baptist world, they very much, once saved, always saved. You don't doubt your salvation. You don't have to, because that's supposed to kind of free you. But, and so what happened in the Calvinist tradition was, well then how do you know who's going to heaven and who's going to hell if it's already been decided? Well, it must be if things are going swell in your life, and you're prospering, and you have good children, and people are healthy. But if you're struggling financially, or if you're sick, and you have all these other, your children are rebellious, or these are signs that you're most probably not part of the elect. And so you wanted to work very, very hard to be as prosperous as you could be so that your neighbors would think you were part of the elect. This idea was carried over by the Puritans into New England because we know from their journals, they kept great journals, that they would sit there in church, because church was like 4 hours long on a Sunday and they're bored to tears. And we know one of the games they played in church on Sunday was to look around the room and try to figure out who was in the elect and who was not in the elect. Because that's the thing, is just because somebody was in your same church family, they might not be elect. So that's the rationale behind the Protestant work ethic, is you want to work your darndest to demonstrate your elect status.
Whether you are or aren't.
But if you're looking, it's looking pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Couldn't that kind of the idea that if you're not doing well in life, you're probably going to hell. Then people, if you believe that you're predestined to hell, well, you're not going to believe, right? Couldn't that also have brought in like how Christians view atheists as evil and doing bad and just angry people?
Or how they view homeless people.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, they think we're totally screwed. Yeah. Although the really neat thing is this is fun. Within Christianity, there are groups that hate each other worse than they hate atheists. That'll be a conversation for another evening. But there's a lot of them. Like Baptists can't stand Pentecostals. Yeah.
Can you give a quick explanation of why the Calvinists took off in America and it didn't take off in the Netherlands or Switzerland?
I was going to say that again. Why
Can
the?
you give a quick explanation why the Calvinist Church took off in the United States and it didn't take off in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Scotland?
Very good question. Let me clarify that. It absolutely did take off. The Calvinist Reformed tradition absolutely did take off in parts of Switzerland. Now, parts of Switzerland remain Catholic. In parts of the Netherlands, for sure, and absolutely in Scotland, and for a very, very long time. Now, the reason we don't see that today is because of the general massive, dramatic decline of religion in Western Europe. But up until fairly recently, Calvinism was like one of the great theologians. I mean, even people who aren't theologians recognize Karl Barth as a great thinker. I mean, even secular people recognize. Karl Barth, one of the most famous theologians of the 20th century, was a Reformed theologian from Switzerland. Karl Barth was Swiss. And so, Reformed Calvinism thrived in the Netherlands, in Scotland, and Switzerland up until, I would say, right after World War II. And all religion has tanked. And you'll go to, and I highly recommend, if you're in Eastern Europe, see some of the Reformation sites. They're beautiful, and especially after the fall of communism, they sunk a lot of money, and the German government has sunk a lot of money into making things look really nice and like they did back in the day, rather than in the grim Stalinist times. And it's worth seeing. But I've been to the church in Wittenberg 5 times for Sunday worship. The church that started the Reformation. I have never seen more than 100 people in it on any given Sunday.
And how many could it hold? Hundreds?
500 maybe? Yeah.
You mentioned something a while ago about the rise of Nazism. I'm wondering, does that start in the Christian faith? Because my understanding is that Jews were persecuted by early Christians, and I don't know, were Nazis, were some of them actually considered themselves Christians?
Absolutely.
What were they?
Well,
I think this needs to be our next seminar.
Yeah.
Church state of Nazism.
That's like, or the.
That's a really, really good question, and that would take me. Yeah, like Hermann Goering was married in the Lutheran Cathedral in Berlin. That's like a 10-minute walk from the Brandenburg Gates. So there's a very, very interesting history there. To a certain extent, some Nazis actually were Christians. To a certain extent, the Nazis co-opted the Christian structures for their own goals. It's a huge topic. But anti-Semitism has always been in Europe on so many different levels. And so that anti-Semitism, so the Nazis tapped into a latent, anti-Semitism that was kind of bubbling just below the surface in Western Europe that had been there forever.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. Why were the Jews hated so much by Martin Luther? But the one I had was, I heard that some modern-day psychologists or psychiatrists thought he made himself bipolar based on some of the things he said and did. Have you ever heard that before? Oh yeah, well, there's been more. Yeah, I've read stuff like that. More stuff has been written on. More biographies have been written on Luther than like anybody except, I don't know, like Lincoln and Jesus or something like that. Erik Erikson, who was one of Freud's disciples, wrote a psychoanalysis of Luther's youth called Young Man Luther, which most people think is total crap today, but when it came out it was really hot. People speculated all kinds of things about Luther's mental state and stuff. I would say the anti-Semitic stuff that he wrote, which was largely in 1543, a pamphlet he wrote called On the Jews and Their Lies, horrible stuff. That's how Luther treated anybody he disagreed with. He said the same exact things about Catholics. He said the same exact things about Calvin wasn't around yet, but the Zwinglists were the other. And so he was not nice, and especially old age. He was like sick all the time. He was in a bad mood. He had kidney stones and all kinds of stuff. So that does not exonerate his anti-Jewish stuff. But his anti-Jewish stuff was in the drinking water in Germany at the time. And the other thing about Luther was when he was younger, he wrote some very positive stuff about Jews when he was younger. And when he was older,
And he said flat out, well, like, we're clearly living in end times, and now that we've purified the church, we've gotten rid of the corruption and the abuses and the indulgences and all that, he expected that the Jews would convert en masse once they saw the truth. And it didn't happen, and it irritated him. So, that's tip of the iceberg on that.
Was it the Jesus thing? Because they didn't accept Jesus and he did?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. And of course, huge, a very, very common meme floating around Europe for centuries had been that Jews were doing what?
Drinking the blood of Christians.
Killing Christian children for their sacrificial ceremonies. Yeah. So, So.
The whole thing maybe goes back to the fact that they're the ones who.
Absolutely, yeah. They're like the scapegoats for the ones who, the Christ killers or whatever. Yeah. Okay. I think I'm talked out.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Another very interesting religion seminar. If anyone has any ideas for any future religion seminars, you can email me or Mike, and we'll see what we can put together. I would like to, we officially have this room until 9 o'clock, but Catherine, I don't think you're going to run us out if we're still drinking and spending money. Okay. So feel free to stay and hang out, but again, please be sure to tip very generously. So they're always glad to see us come back. And thank you for coming.